While Minister of Public Safety Dominic LeBlanc testified today as the highlight at the conclusion of the first week of the public hearings of the Foreign Interference Commission, the real low light is how little meaningful information was actually shared with the audience given his testimony and given the nature of the questions that were asked and not asked by the participants. Robert Krejcik here reporting in Ottawa, Ontario for Rebel News. Dominic LeBlanc's testimony primarily circled around the same theme we've been hearing all week from most of the presenters and witnesses. Basically, broad, elementary, pedantic discussions of the need to balance competing interests between, on the one hand, the public interest in disclosure of information, transparency, and on the other hand, the need for state secrets to be kept classified to protect national security and the broader national interest. These are things that grade 7 children can come to understand, but most of the past week was dedicated to explaining that theme, along with some procedural and regulatory explanations regarding processes within the government for both classification and declassification of information, as well as some legalities governing those processes. Despite the week being a sort of introduction to future proceedings, at no point was the term foreign interference actually defined. Now, of course, that term has broad definitional parameters, but still there was no working definition provided, and there was essentially no introduction or sharing of instances, even if in an unspecific way, to share with the commission in a public sense different techniques, methods used by foreign states and non-state actors towards foreign influence or interference operations. The federal government established the Foreign Interference Commission ostensibly to examine, to investigate allegations, claims, mostly made within the political and media classes, of foreign interference and influence operations waged within Canada from foreign states and non-state actors, specifically affecting the 2019 and 2021 federal elections, although the FIC claims it intends to examine foreign influence and interference operations in a broader context as well. Michael Chong in Ontario and Jenny Kwan from British Columbia have said they have been targeted by foreign interference and coercion operations from the Chinese Communist Party. They are both participants in this commission, in the inquiry, although they have legal representation, so the lawyers will be speaking on their behalf. Han Dong, an MP in Ontario, formerly with the Liberal Party, now a so-called independent, was reported to have been advising the Chinese consulate in his riding against the release of 2 Canadians ahead of the 2021 federal election. Allegedly, he advised the Chinese consulate not to release these Canadians for fear that this release would politically benefit the Conservative Party. He's denied the allegations, and his lawyer, who is speaking on his behalf in this hearing, is saying that information that's leaked from intelligence agencies is not always accurate. Michael Chong's lawyer spoke today about the federal government's failure to inform his client, an MP in Ontario, and other politicians in Canada of intimidation campaigns waged against them by China.
In their evidence, the experts and witnesses you've heard have made clear that the protection of Canada from interference by our adversaries requires constant vigilance by our elected officials and our public servants. Mr. Chong came into these hearings with profound respect for the work our national security agencies do to keep this country safe and to live up to the promises we have made to our allies. The evidence we've heard so far reaffirms Mr. Chong's confidence in our national security professionals. But something has clearly gone wrong. Despite the expertise and dedication of our national security community, Mr. Chong and his family have been exposed to threats of coercion by PRC officials and agents operating in this country. Other MPs have also been targets, And almost all of what we know of these events has come not from awareness-raising sessions like the one we've had this week, or from statements by cabinet ministers, or from briefings of MPs by officials, or from testimony at parliamentary hearings. Instead, almost all of what we know so far comes from newspaper reports based on sources in the intelligence community.
So to recap the entire week, the biggest irony that jumps right out is how there have been repeated warnings and cautions, advisories from all sorts of participants, including the commissioner, about the constraints placed upon the commission with respect to time. In the terms of public hearings, there are only 3 weeks slotted for them. And this entire week, basically, most of it, has been dedicated to this very sophomoric explanation of procedures, regulations, broad concepts, again, about balancing the national security interest with secrecy and public disclosure and transparency on the other. It's this long university-style lecture. Now, what was not said, this is what's important. There were no mentions at all of specific instances of foreign interference or foreign influence operations. Even in a broad sense, any explanation of how these influence operations are launched by foreign states or non-state actors, with one small exception, when CSIS director David Vignon was explaining how he has reservations about declassifying and disclosing certain information that's deemed confidential by the federal government for fear that it would reveal to foreign adversaries, specifically China in this instance, the types of things that the federal government and the federal intelligence and surveillance apparatus is paying attention to. So aside from that one subtle allusion to not disclosing things to reveal what types of things CSIS is investigating, there was no mention at all of how these foreign influence operations are run, and this sort of undercuts an element of the mandate of the commission, which is to raise public awareness of foreign influence, of foreign interference. One of the themes that has recurred within these proceedings is how an informed citizenry really is the best political vaccine, if you will, against the virus of political interference and influence. So without actually informing and educating the Canadian population about how these operations are run, how can Canadians actually prepare themselves? So this week really was much ado about nothing for the most part. Another gaping hole with this Foreign Interference Commission, at least as far as the past week has gone, is an absence of any discussion, any investigation of political interference or influence operations from the United States or US-based institutions. From academia to US-based news media outlets, probably more acutely the biggest tech companies based in the US. There was no examination, no mention whatsoever of censorship and information control by the largest tech companies on the planet, and how that sort of technological control over the flow of information can shape public opinion and bend or determine political outcomes in the context of elections. Another absence from today's proceedings and the week more broadly was that of any penetrating questions of the fact witnesses. A bunch of lawyers are here representing different NGOs. A lot of these NGOs present themselves as representative of different ethnic groups, diaspora minorities living here in Canada. For example, Russians who are now Canadian, Chinese who are now Canadian, Ukrainians who are now Canadian. And these NGOs are saying that these diaspora minorities are being targeted by foreign influence operations, specifically those that intimidate, coerce, and manipulate. And these lawyers, when questioning certain fact witnesses, most notably David Vignon, who is current CSIS director, and today we saw Dominic LeBlanc, Minister of Public Safety, they weren't asked about any specific instances of intimidation that any members of these minority groups say that they've been subjected to. In other words, the fact witnesses, those who have positions of authority right now in the federal government, in senior positions, were not asked to address or explain or respond to any specific instances of threats, coercion, manipulation, or any other sort of foreign influence operation targeting these minority ethnicities that these lawyers and their NGOs claim to represent. Remember, folks, we don't get government bailouts. We're not like these so-called mainstream media. We're accountable to you, our dear audience. So please visit our website, protectourdemocracy.ca, contribute to our operation so we can keep doing this in the field journalism, and stay up to date with our ongoing coverage.